I would like to inform everyone that feel free to speak up if you have any comments, any suggestions, any worries, whatever the problem may be. I will also ask you if you would like to share your opinion, try to keep it short and sweet, just because in some cases other people would like to offer their opinion as well. And we only have an hour available for this working group. I'm going to begin now saying that this is the agenda that I have this week with multiple meetings with the different working groups, including some groups that they are having a morning and an afternoon session in order to accommodate people from different time zones. Particulate matter, let's focus on this one, and let me begin with the first questionnaire which we shared a month ago about space availability. The majority of the people agreed what about space availability and what we are proposing, which basically we would like to link the different um, average hour concentrations with different indoor spaces in order to help people navigate a little bit better on how they on or what levels of pollution they should achieve, if you like, in the different areas. Some people, they are suggesting some changes, and we will see some of their comments at the end of the working group. I have them all there. Then some other people are proposing that it's better to take a different approach with target limits rather than have average limits. But this is very difficult for us to do, as we are basing all of our research of what existing already in all around the world with standards that they are already available. Does anyone would like to share their thoughts on that, or maybe any additional questions I may have? If not, I can move forward. Okay, so here I summarized all of the different pollutants, all of the different limits that they are proposed, and we could find, taking into account different resources like the STC 34, WHO, some independent studies from the scientific community, and also some standards from the German government. And as you can see, when we say max, we are talking about the ceiling limits, and we only have two, with the minimum value that we could find at 35 micrograms per cubic meter, and 50 was the maximum number. We didn't have anything for 15 and 30 minutes, and then for 1 hour, we only had one paper from Professor Lydia Maroska, and she and her colleagues were proposing 50 micrograms per cubic meter. Nothing for the 8 hours, and then we have the 24 hours that we could find 19 standards, and for 1 year 17. And there we could find also 8 where didn't specify whether they had like a ceiling limit or if the numbers that they are proposing were based on average time periods. So we classified them as undefined. So looking on all of these numbers, we propose those numbers for the standard that we would like to adopt and for the ultimate version of the Go IQS. So basically for the 1 year average limits, we're proposing 5 micrograms, which is the same thing as the WHO, 15 micrograms for 24-hour means, and then for 1 hour, the 15 micrograms that Professor Maroska and her team had proposed last year. And then we had the problem that we didn't have anything for the 8 hours. So in a conversation with some other professors, we discussed basically to take the closest guideline values that we can find from the different hour frame, because we didn't know the shape of the dose response relationship. So it was very difficult for us to extrapolate. That was the reason we proposed another 15 micrograms per cubic meter. The majority of people agreed back then. I don't know now if you have changed opinion or if you would like to add something to that. Remember, you have to enable your microphone. And
Hi, this is Albert Sane. I'm a toxicologist in the US, and I'll make the same comment I made this morning on the earlier call, which is that if the shortest averaging time to alert people is 1 hour, this will allow considerably higher average exposures that are of shorter duration, as commonly occurs, for instance, in cooking in a kitchen. It might be a 30, it could be a 30-minute exposure of 30 or a 15-minute exposure of 60, um, or even a 5-minute exposure of 180. And I just want people to be aware of that. That's how instruments would be measuring this in the real world. And we now know that these are not toxicologically equivalent exposures. Same for all the gases as well. It's mathematically equivalent, but not toxicologically. And I wonder if everybody's okay with that. 1 hour is the shortest limit. In a lot of occupational settings, there are 15-minute short-term exposure limits or STELs that act as a ceiling limit and require evacuation when they're exceeded, and they're typically much higher than the 1 hour. Thanks.
Yeah. And as I mentioned in the morning, Albert, we as GoQS, this is the reason we're also developing the index, right? Like, how are you going to communicate this information back to the public, and how they can protect themselves from high concentration, even in a short period? And for this reason, the index that we are works in real time, like in continuous mode, thanks to the technology of the lower cost or low cost sensors that they are available in the market. And that way they will be able to, let's say, take decisions and actions upon those high concentrations of pollution.
Except, as I understand, the AQI and those actions will be based on these same limits. They will be basically treating these averaging limits as if they were ceiling limits to interpret an AQI at any moment. And it will be based on the immediate levels, not all of the 1 hour or 8 hour prior averages.
So that's the subject to discuss after we finalize those limits and how we perceive and understand, and we can benchmark different buildings. So right now we are proposing some limits for people to guide around, and later we will develop the thresholds for the index in order to classify if the air quality is good, moderate, and unhealthy.
Thank you. I'll put my vote in still for a separate than STEL or a ceiling limit that would give people a faster warning than having to wait 1 hour, by which time the exposure might have already be over.
Exactly. So based on the technology and the instruments that they use, they won't have to wait. They will get immediate notification on their device. But at the end of the day, if we would like to address or benchmark how well they did throughout the day or the year or whatever the case will be, they will look on the average limits that the instrument record over time. John, I see you have raised your hand.
Yeah, a couple things. One is my perception was on air quality standards like this that it's really intended to address, I'd say, long-term health issues versus acute. Like you need to get out of the space, and I just want to make sure that's correct, right? This is more about over the long period. You should keep your air quality within these constraints to maintain general health, right? It's not about you need to get out of the space because it's unsafe.
Yes, but at the same time, if instruments and the index that they're going to be placed in different environments, they will be able to detect high concentrations of a specific pollutant. We would like to make people aware of it, and in order for them to take action, right?
I understand. I just want to make sure that we're dialing in the focus because, like, for example, carbon monoxide, right? There are carbon monoxide detectors today that are specifically designed for telling you when it's not safe and getting you out of there, right? This is a very, very different purpose than what I think the CO of an air quality standard is. That's more about, if you're at a long-term exposed to higher than normal CO levels, that has long-term health implications. I think they're two distinctly different purposes. I think it's important to separate those two.
Yeah. Okay. And also, it's also very important to understand where do you spend most of your time, right? Like if that's the reason, for example, in the space sustainability, we have classified the domestic environment under the 24-hour average period.
Yes. So then I'll go to my second question, which is, in particular with these proposed limits, the reality is that when you build a building or set up intervention measures, you're really, the best you can do is a certain level below the outside ambient. And the indoor PM levels are going to float up and down depending on what's going on outside. And so, for example, if there's a wildfire event outside, keeping it at 20 micrograms per meter cubed or even 30 is pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess my question is how do we account for those situations? And what does it mean when you're at this limit? Because again, we're used to working for, like for example, hospitals that have standards, and there's actually tracking programs that say you've got to maintain logs that say you're below these thresholds all the time. And so I'm trying to think through, what is the end goal for this standard? Is it that basically you need to have proof that you're maintaining below the levels, and therefore we need to be maybe more conservative or have exceptions for events that are out of control of the building operator, or these guidelines where you're kind of getting a continuous score?
Mm-hmm. Albert, please.
That's it. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think that's the critical difference here, is that we're talking today about looking at the standards, and if they're all set as time-weighted averages, but then we also want the AQI to alert people when there is a critical ceiling level that's exceeded. That will, as I understand, require thinking about then a second set of limits. It's not appropriate to use the average limit as a ceiling that requires immediate action, because they weren't adopted for that, and building managers would be upset if automatic controls start changing ventilation settings because an average limit was briefly exceeded for 5 or 10 minutes. So I think when it comes to turning instruments into actionable controllers, they need logic that can interpret both ceilings and averages. And I hope that's the direction we're headed, is to have both. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, so basically this is what we're trying to do. And then we have the starter tier, where basically we have, again, 1, 8, 24 hour and 1 year average limits, but now the numbers are more relaxed, and again based on what we could found out there from the different recommendations and standards that they exist already, or guidelines. So now for 1 year we're proposing 8 micrograms per cubic meter, 24 hours we're proposing 25 micrograms per cubic meter, and the rest of them as well, they're going to be 25 micrograms per cubic meter. Remember, the first tier, the starter, is there to help places around the globe where, for socioeconomical reasons and technological reasons, monitoring the air is not as easy, and we will need to allow them to adapt by following those guidelines first, and then following the most strict guideline, which is from the ultimate tier. And then we asked participants to share their opinion regarding the measurements of particle count number for some microparticles, 0.3 and 0.5. And the majority again agreed on asking the researchers and the industry on weighting in with same data. So here I would like to ask some people that you may know around you, and they may have or not done some research, or maybe they have data around those particle sizes, to communicate with us and share their input on the different levels. This is, for example, the only standard that we could find regarding particle size numbers, and the different concentrations that they recommended. This ISO standard is meant for clean room applications, which means they do not look for the health implications those particles have, but rather what's the implications of the particle in the production of a variety of products, maybe for pharmaceuticals or maybe for military purposes or whatever the case will be. And they are proposing keeping the particle count number below those numbers. And they have an array of ISO classrooms starting from 1, which is the most strict, and then they go up to ISO 8. ISO 9 is considering like ambient air according to the ISO standard. And what I did was to do some examples or some tests inside HEPA-controlled offices, and also measuring the outdoor air and comparing them with the different ISO classes. Now, the ISO specifications, they use particles per square meter, sorry, per cubic meter, but we're using per cubic centimeter in order to make the numbers smaller and more digestible. So as you can see, for 0.3 and 0.5 microns, the concentrations are around 8 to 1 particle per cubic centimeter in a HEPA-controlled office. And in the background air, like taking the sensors, the monitors outside, I took the measurements when I was in the US. I would like to mention that, and during spring. Maybe in winter or maybe in summer, values will change there as well. So the concentrations were higher, as you can see, at 45 particles per cubic centimeter and 5.5 for 0.5 microns. And then the specifications for ISO rooms are quite strict, with 10 particles per cubic centimeter. This number does not exist, but as they extrapolate from one level to another, I was able to do the same thing and fill those 3 last cells with the values. And finally, as ISO class 9 considers the ambient air, they are quite higher from what I could measure in that particular experiment that I did. So basically, if you know someone that they can help us on determining those values, we can have an initial conversation with them, see what they are proposing or what you are proposing, and adapting a number which can be flexibly changed. Again, this number is not going to be based on health outcomes because it's very soon to have something like that at the moment, but rather on how well filters work in the indoor space as well. John, I see you raised your hand.
I think that it's too soon for this. As much as I like the idea of having a standard for the smaller particles, I don't think that there's enough instrumentation out there to do it. There are some laboratory grade instrumentation, but in terms of mainstream sensors, pretty much all we got is the PM 2.5, maybe PM 1. And I don't see that requiring something that requires a sensor that is not on the marketplace, how that's going to do anybody any good.
Well,
and go ahead,
please.
And then the second one is that the reality, we're out there trying to sell good indoor air quality all the time, and we need significant justifications for the additional costs. And so I think the other part that makes us a little bit ahead of the curve is I don't know if there's enough studies that justify the additional filtration down at the smaller particle sizes that create the benefit that is documented. I mean, I think we all have a gut feeling that it's there, but I'm not sure there's enough studies, again, probably because we don't have the sensors, right, that justify the benefit of that. So as much as I love the idea of going here, I don't think the data is there yet.
You're right. The data's we don't have the data. That's true, but we do have the technology. The problem is that all of those low-cost sensors that we use at the moment, they convert what they are measuring, which is basically the particle count number, into PM with algorithms. Now, the majority of them, they do not go through any calibration for particle count number because they rely heavily on the algorithms in order to give you the estimation of the mass. But I mean, if there is a need, Or let me tell you the same thing in the other way. If there is no need, they will never go through looking into those particle sizes. I had some other conversations with some academics in this group, and they were saying, why you don't have nanoparticles? And I say, because nanoparticles are far more expensive to measure in the indoor space. I don't think there is going to be anyone that's going to install a condensation particle counter in a building to measure the different sizes of particulates. But this technology of submicron particles exists there because all of those Sensirion plant power sensors can measure from 0.3 and up. And this is the reason we propose those numbers. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's not, we cannot pull this this standard or these recommendations forward because we lack the data, basically. But I would like to try, if that makes sense. Please.
Yeah, I think maybe we're lumping a couple things together. One is an air quality standard, which to me is like a threshold of saying this is what is considered good and this is bad, or something like that. I think there's an air quality index, which is either a continuous score, which is indicating when the air quality is better or worse, right? And then I think there's another part of this, which is aspirations for new instrumentation out there so that we can learn more. I think there's several elements here that are all being put together in one thing. My concern is that if there's standards like this in your open air quality standard, my customers are going to see it as irrelevant and just ignore it because it's too aggressive. So just that's a danger of doing this way is that if you're pushing for instrumentations that we can't buy or we can't afford to put in, then it's just going to get ignored.
Albert?
I have to echo the same comment for all of the other gas standards as well. We can push a bit on industry to improve, say, the resolution of the sensors that are already out there, but we can't get ahead of them. They're not there yet. We can't go where they're not already there. And I think we should be cognizant of a real range of quality issues, and I think there's a lot of particulate devices on the market now that if they were tested, they couldn't resolve the difference between 15 and 25 reliably or consistently.
Yeah, maybe you're right. I won't disagree because I know the sensor panorama out there. I know what kind of sensor technology exists, and I know that we do have sensors that they do those measurements, but they have to work a little bit harder around them in order to make the data out of those sensors more accurate, if you like, and more reliable. Because currently it's happening what I said earlier, like they really care about PM mass, so they just use algorithms in order to extrapolate the information from the particle count side of the actual sensor in order to give you some values. And as this transformation of data from particle count to mass allows them to cheat, if you like, a little bit, they're having better results as PM2.5 rather than particle count number sensors. Okay, excellent feedback. And those now are some of the comments that people shared with us throughout the voting. I don't remember who said what. So if you see your comment here and you would like to add something extra, feel free. We're more than happy to hear you. Also, like, for example, here, one of, I know who said that because he wrote his name next to it, Mac. He was particularly talking about this problem. Like, if we rely on micrograms per cubic meter instead of particle counts, then we are losing part of the picture of what's happening with the particles. Mac is expert in filtration, so he knows very well everything about filtration technologies and how filters can capture from gases and particulates. So I also share the same opinion about the microamps per cubic meter, for example. Some other comments was the fact that I thought that for starters, the idea, okay, so they are talking about the starter tier in comparison with the ultimate. And they argue that we should have the same limits for the starter and ultimate. Does anyone agree with that?
I think if we go with both ceilings and averages, that the ceilings change. The averages could be progressively more protective, but a ceiling, I think, should be consistent in all cases. If it's established that that's harmful for enough of the population to worry about, men, women, or children. So again, it comes down to this critical difference between letting people know when a ceiling has been exceeded instantly versus many hours potentially later or a day later after an average has been exceeded.
For some of the pollutants that we have in our agenda, like carbon dioxide and radon, we have ceiling limits actually. We won't adapt the space adaptability, and we will have one threshold for all of them.
But when you define, I think you need to be consistent with the ceiling limit. What is the depth? Is it a safety thing where you need to be, the space is unsafe and it needs to be addressed immediately? The definition of what that threshold should be and how it links to other things needs to be consistent across all the parameters. To me, once you get past the ceiling, then we're just talking about relative scoring, and you want to rank so there's a continuum between down to ultimate, right? It's just a relative ranking, and the goal is to get as low as you can, subject to the constraints of the building you're in and the economics of the intervention measures.
Okay.
Some buildings are just going to be too hard to get clean, right? Others are going to be easy. Or some customers may not be able to afford as much, right? And the hope is that we can do some good everywhere. And even moving it a little bit better is better than nothing.
Then some other people were talking about different buildings like warehouses and manufacturing facilities. To be honest with you, I don't feel like those environments are of our concern, because I think they fall under more of employee safety, especially blue collar employees, and how their health is a subject of protection in those different environments. Because I don't think there is any warehouse out there that they filter the air that they are providing inside those buildings. Maybe I'm wrong, but let me know what you're thinking about it. Unless they need to comply with some ISO's regulations, especially in pharmaceuticals, let's say.
I point to the WHO limits adopted in 2020 for both indoor and outdoor space, the first dedicated to both indoor and outdoor, but they do still specifically exclude all workplaces where they recognize various countries have their own occupational limits, and usually they're less protective than the WHO limits. And I urge us to keep in mind the critical difference that the workers are only expected to be exposed 8 hours a day for 40 hours a week, while the public is 24/7 indoors and out. So
yeah,
looking at that total. Thanks,
John.
Yeah. Another thing that's always challenged me is I think we need to acknowledge that all the data associated with PM exposure and health impacts is really correlations, right? We're generally, there's a bunch of studies that say, in general, when PM is high, people are less healthy. We don't know exactly what is causing it in that PM. And the example that's challenging me is we do a lot of monitoring in hospitals, And we can see that there are treatments that are being done in hospitals that are clearly increasing the PM. And you can actually track the PM down the hallway to the nurse's station.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, in that instance, the hospital has made a decision that for that patient, increasing the particulate count is part of some treatment that is inherently good, right? But from our classic analysis of looking at correlation, right, high PM is bad. And so I'm still struggling, like, what do I, how do we handle that situation? Should we be putting a filter in that room to keep the cross-contamination down the hallway from happening? Or if it's good for the patient, is it good for everybody else? I don't know. But those are the things that make this challenging.
Mm-hmm. So indeed, in some hospitals, they use specific sizes of aerosols in order to deliver drugs to the patients. But you do not want those kinds of drugs to go and be inhaled by someone else that has not any health problems, or maybe has different health problems that may interact with their condition. Who knows the complexity those different drugs have.
Yeah, I generally agree with you in that one. But the question is that are there some particles that are associated with industrial pollution that are more harmful than other ones? Everybody knows that it's pretty easy to generate particles by, putting an ultrasonic transducer in salt water, right? Or even in water.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just salt, right? And there's a lot of salt in our bodies. So is that bad? I don't know.
That raises another problem. The composition of the particles. Recently, the European Union said that in some super sites that they measure in air pollution outdoors, they will install specific instruments that they will be able to tell how those particles are made from. So what's the chemical makeup of those particles, in order to understand better the implications that they have on human health. I think it's, again, soon. It's like the sizes that we want to measure them, right? Like, it's very soon for us to determine now the source and the composition of the particle and the health outcomes. But in general, we know that particles that they are produced from burning biomass or combustion, they are more dangerous than particles that they are coming, let's say, from the Sahara of the desert, or maybe from sea salt or sea spray.
Where would you put the particulate matter from the decomposition of tires on the road in that hierarchy?
Yeah, that's another source of rubber and microplastic in general. Any other comment here? Okay, so more or less we're talking about the same thing. Hospitals and in schools indeed have a dynamic indoor air quality. Hospitals are often more complex in terms of indoor air quality, given the presence of medical equipment, cleaning agents, and varying levels of air contamination due to the different patients and treatments. Schools, on the other hand.
Sorry to interrupt you. There is a comment in the chat room.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe I can comment just regarding the issue that you were discussing previously.
Mm-hmm.
Just one figure regarding the occupational health limits that could be applied in Spain for PM 2.5. The only reference for limit, except for asbestos or whatever, is just 3 milligrams per cubic meter. So, 3,000 micrograms per cubic meter.
Mm-hmm.
I even assuming that every type of particle could be different or could be have different impact on health. These limits are, I think, are crazy in some way. So, any application of the limits that we are discussing in indoors, in general indoors environments for occupational health are. I think that for other compounds we can make similar comments, but especially for PM 2.5 is, for me at least, is in some way I can understand pretty well the application of these kind of limits, thinking about the other limits that we are discussing for indoors. But yes, just as a comment.
Thank you. Yeah, those limits like 3,000 micrograms per cubic meter, they're meant for occupations like in the mines, where dirt from digging the earth is on those levels. Is it safe? We all know it isn't, but it is allowed in order for people to go and work there.
Anyway, if it's safe, the further discussions that we can have for indoors or other limits maybe don't make sense too much. But
Yeah.
I understand that they should use EPIs and things like this. But just as a comment to keep in mind.
Okay, so I would like to summarize a little bit what we discussed here today, and basically ask again if someone strongly disagrees with those numbers that we proposed, and if they're proposing some kind of a different approach on those levels for the starter and ultimate tier of the Go IQS, which, as you can see, I share here on your screen right now. Feel free to express your opinion. And if no one has any comments around them, then I will finalize the meeting. And hopefully tomorrow I will be able to post also the results on the website for the rest of the people to comment that couldn't attend today.
Can I ask from the audience how people feel about the ability of current PM 2.5 instruments as configured in consumer devices can consistently distinguish 15 from 25? Presumably it would get the difference, the direction of the difference correctly, but I'm wondering if this is enough separation to consistently be able to tell these two levels apart with consumer grade prices. And has anybody tested this and share some result?
Albert, I can speak for commercial grade, like the sensors that are on the order of $300 to $500 that we put in commercial buildings. I think that they can easily distinguish between 25 and 15. I think once you get below 5, it gets a little sketchy. Most of the sensors we have only report in 1 microgram per meter cube increments, so you're getting into the bit binary stuff. But I really don't think you can see much below 5 with the current sensors. But I definitely see, you can easily see the difference between 15 and 25. So I'll throw out again, my concern is I'm kind of channeling the building operator, and the reality is the building operator can control outside air intake rates, filtration rates, and in fact, outside air intake is generally constrained by another standard, right? They can control filtration rates and some extent generation rates, right? And when there's events outside where PM is higher, they can go above these limits without because of things that are out of their control. And I still think that the standard needs to have some component that makes it relative to outside air, or some exception that acknowledges that there's some cases that are out of the control of the building operator, such that they don't feel like they're going to lose. Again, that's just been my experiences with these standards, is people are worried about getting nicked, and that's going to be even at the 25 level. I mean, I live here in Milwaukee, and during the Canadian wildfires last summer, the outdoor ambient was above 250. And there's no way you can keep a building at 25 when the outdoor ambient is 250. Mm-hmm. And so that's my big concern about a fixed standard without some kind of exception or some way of acknowledging that that's subject to normal outdoor air ambient conditions.
We already have taken into consideration, the ratio between indoor-outdoor space, because we are aware of those situations. And if you remember, 2 months or 3 months ago, we asked the rest of the people as well their opinion of like having exception days for those wildfire periods that happen. But at the same time, the message that we got back from that voting period was that, I mean, we are talking about health and how we can protect occupants. And if we are not going to communicate that there is a problem with the indoor space, so then we are failing on communicating air quality with them, if that makes sense. And where I live, for example, concentrations of PM during winter is around 50 micrograms per cubic meter because of wood burning. Indoors, I try to keep air quality as good as possible by controlling the ventilation and the air that I take on specific times of day that allows me, and I know that they're not burning at the time because maybe they're sleeping, in order to bring fresh air from the outside indoors. And again, by filtering the air through HEPA filters.
I understand. I think that, again, that's where you get into, and I don't think the science is there, where you're getting into like a trade-off between bringing in outside air to dilute the gas phase contaminants, right? But at the same time, by bringing in that outside air, you're bringing in particles.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we're anywhere near balancing at what point does the particle concentration be high enough that it justifies lower ventilation rates. But that's where we need to get as an industry, right? I don't think we're there yet. Again, and to me, and maybe I'm reading the terms too literally, when you say open air quality standard, a standard is thou shalt, that's usually written in standard language, which is compliance language, which says thou shalt must, or you must. And that is used by building inspectors, standards for operating hospitals that say this is your rule and you have to follow it. If you change it to a guideline, I think it's different, right? Then it's saying this is what we think is ideal, and you know, yes, sometimes you go above that, but this is what we want to report on because this is what we think it should be. A standard is something you have to meet, and I think that that's really important language differentiation.
And this is what we aspire to do, right? Like we begin by building something around the guidelines that they are available out there, but eventually we want these values to be adapted by bodies that they can enforce those numbers. We will never be able, as COAQS, to enforce those numbers to anyone. But if, for example, green building certificate organizations adapt the limits that we're proposing, then we are forcing those limits in those buildings.
But then
and governments as well.
Yeah, but you just acknowledge there are some cases where you can't meet the limits. So you see that you can't have both.
I mean, you can't have both, but can you control all the environments, even the outdoors? How many times they surpass the limits outdoors where they have to follow them?
Well, the outdoor, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that so yes, I can, let's take my Milwaukee case where it was 250 micrograms per meter cubed. I could design my building to deal with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm adding a ton of cost for it was 5 days, one summer, right? And that is extreme cost that I'm adding for an exception, right? And it's just going to be uneconomical to meet that standard. I mean, there's got to be a degree of pragmatism in this, or it just, I mean, the challenges will just be ignored. And I don't think anybody here wants that.
Albert, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, that was a fascinating debate, you guys. I'm glad we had time to hear it. It raised for me just a simple semantic issue that John did, and that is that at this moment, these are recommendations. They're based in part on WHO recommendations that are specifically called guidelines. And they're also based in part on some adopted standards in some countries, depending on the pollutant. So I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves. And I urge us to think about it and invite you to give us another poll question at some point soon to ask if we would like to go forward with these things now that we're agreeing on the limits, to describe them as air quality guidelines, recommendations, standards. I think standards is the wrong word unless they are standards somewhere already uniformly and yet. And I don't want us to have the false impression the first time people hears of it. I think in the building management community, I couldn't agree more. If they hear that there's new standards they have to comply with, that changes their mindset when they start to learn about it compared to, oh, these are new international guidelines. Right? Thanks.
But if we take an example, the ISO standards, it's not like you have to follow them, but they are standards.
Well, actually, you do have to follow them in a whole lot of contexts.
Well, let me tell you that that's not truth, especially for the clean room industry. You may need to follow them if you want to have the certification of the room, let's say, but there is no one that enforces you if you have a clean room to have an ISO standard.
But that's not, so a customer then says, thou shalt build a room that meets ISO standard blank, blank, blank for clean rooms, right? And then if I go to that customer and I'm going to have to design that it meets that standard 365 days a year, 24/7. And I'm going to have to look at the conditions, right, to make sure that I have enough excess filtration to deal with the worst case day. Because the customer asked for it to be complied with that standard, even though it's optional, that's in the spec. Now I've added a lot of cost to that clean room design, maybe for 2 or 3 days. So yes, I agree. Standards are standards that say this is a benchmark in the sand that thou shalt comply with, and compliance is optional. But once the customer puts it in the requirements, it's not optional anymore. I've got to meet it, and that's what that's the point and the purpose of a standard, is to say, because it's written in language that says thou must, right? Always, if you look at the differences in how standards are written, it's should, shall, whereas guidelines are written may, could. There's fuzziness in a guideline. I don't think. I think that this is, for now, and maybe that's part of this, is it's an air quality guideline, and maybe there's some elements of it that become a standard. But I'm concerned about the idea of writing it in a shall language, right? Just my 2 cents worth.
Okay, yeah, thank you. We will take them into consideration, and to be honest with you, no one has shared this information with us prior to this meeting, so I'm glad to hear them.
I want to point out one other reason it is better a guideline than a standard is a standard doesn't typically give the person trying to follow the standard the choice of following the optimal guideline or the whatever we call the other one. And in this case, all of the pollutant limits will have this choice built in. And if there's no other criteria that determines who can make what choice and when, we should be expecting, I think most managers and build performance spec people would choose the less expensive option here. And is that what we anticipate? And I think it's not plausible to think that any country or region or authority would adopt both at the same time. They're going to pick one or the other.
I mean, we already have on GoAQS people from governments. They don't, in some cases, they don't represent the government, but they do have influence there. So even for us at the moment, it's a little bit unknown of how to state some of the things, and in order to be flexible and allow others to see what we are doing eventually, right? And adapt. GoAQS what wants? It wants to make everyone follow, let's say, the same framework around air quality in order to protect themselves, rather than relying on governments that may or not have standards or thresholds or limits around air quality, whatever the term will be. We want to facilitate this kind of information to everyone. This is what we are working basically. Okay, if someone else would like to speak, Kiro, yes, please. We can hear you now, I think.
I can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about in case the limits are trouble to set a standard. What about to increase over time? Means start with more less conservative limits and then reducing the limits over the time. Like for example, 2025, 2026, and reducing this limit over time. In case to I don't know if you understand what I mean.
Like you are proposing, like every year we update the standard and we lower the thresholds, right?
Or we just give it a roadmap of how the standard can be reduced over time. We can start for now to be in time with a higher limit, and then we can move to a much lower limit. So the technology will move, the filtration will be improved, the sensor technology will be improved,
Mhm.
and we give time to be compliant to a standard, maybe much more accepted, flexible and accepted, like happens with the green deals, the automotive and so on in the environment, outdoor.
Someone else would like to comment on that?
My
I'll-
clients wouldn't do that. They don't like having to upgrade their equipment on a schedule like that. If they've bought into a protection scheme and they were told this is a global standard, they don't want to be budgeting for overhauls of all that equipment or even the software and retesting itself every 5 or 10 years, and certainly not every year, unless there was some new development to warrant it. But again, I think this comes back to regulations or standards are not as flexible as recommendations and guidelines, which you could be adjusting in real time and without confusing people about the process, because ISO standards and every other code standard any of us have worked on, we know is a much more formal process. Thanks.
Okay. And someone else agreed with your comment, Albert, as well, according to the comments. Okay. Yes, in general, having, in my opinion, is the same thing. Like having to update the standard, like in a very short periods of times, is very time consuming, and then people cannot keep up with the changes.
Just, I'm going to pivot a little bit. Just another thought or topic is there an opportunity to define, going back to the fine particles and the smaller particles, is there a role for this standard to define what is the next generation of IAQ measurement package? And the idea is that if the building community and the scientific community begin to agree on the next level, right, starting to get today, for example, the de facto measurements are temperature, relative humidity, CO2, and PM 2.5, maybe C, right? But maybe if we can get the next level, which is a more fine particle size, ozone, CO, and get those instruments out there, so we can now start collecting baseline data to develop the use cases. Maybe that's a contribution, and something to maybe a layer to what we're working on is defining the next. Yes, you're used to doing these IAQ sensors in buildings, right? And we've got good data that shows that this is the minimum standard and why you should do this. We think the next level of sensor is this, and we encourage anybody who's doing research to use these sensors so we can all see how this information relates to health outcomes.
Perfect comment and input. Thank you. Yeah. All right. I don't see any other hands or comments. So
just a question from me.
yes.
So we have created we have the starter and the ultimate limits. So when the starter, should we stop using the starter guide and use the ultimate? Do you give them some timeline, some guidance on when to move to the next level?
No, but basically the thought is that if you live in places where air pollution is high all year round, then it's not possible for you to lower and reach those strict limits from the ultimate version. And basically you are trying to achieve those levels from the starter tier.
Okay. So it's not like an incremental thing. Okay, you start.
It is, but
Okay.
there is not type. It's not something that we say that you have to follow to the next level tier after a year of using it. Like John was mentioned earlier, depending the air pollution in the outdoor space, it's very difficult in some cases to have indoor air quality in such a pristine way of 5 micrograms per cubic meter in an annual average. So it depends also with the efforts the governments in this country are doing in order to reduce ambient air pollution, right? And then having those kind of buildings moving towards more strict values with the ultimate tier.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you. All right, we are reaching an hour. I think that's all for today. I will try to summarize everything and share the video online. So you can always comment after this session publicly on our website. And thank you all for coming in this meeting today. I appreciate all the comments. They really help us develop the GoEQS, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.